To our June pop-up. I'm Christina Gawergi, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Chief Communications and Community Building Officer at Independent Sector. This is Independent Sector's second pop-up, and we're really excited for you to be here. Before we get started, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the Washington, D.C. region, the ancestral home of the Nankachink, Anacostan, and Piscataway people who continue to live in the area and are working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I'd also like to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by the labor of enslaved people. Additionally, I want to acknowledge that more than 1 million people have been lost to COVID-19, and millions of folks have died needlessly by gun violence in this country. It is important that we honor this collective grief and loss and work together to heal and advocate for change. Now onto the pop-up. For those who don't know, Upswell was created by Independent Sector in 2018 to be a platform driven by a community of changemakers at our nonprofits, foundations, businesses, academia, government, and other community-based organizations from around the country. In recent years, our charge has been clear: to build a healthy and just nation. Our community includes an incredible set of member organizations that work with us to shape our strategies and drive our public policy and practice change. If you are not a member of Independent Sector and want to learn more, please visit us at independentsector.org/membership. So today we are going to be talking about the importance between bridges, building bridges across racial, economic, and ideological divides toward a true belonging for all people. While I introduce our speakers and get to the agenda for today, please feel free to start using the chat to introduce yourselves. Please give us your names, pronouns, location, and organization. After today, we have one more virtual pop-up in September where we will focus on transforming our systems, and our annual gathering on November 15th, where we will bring all of our collective learnings together post-election and sort of kick off next year's Upswell programming. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make all of this possible. They include Walmart, the Fetzer Institute, the Center for Creative Leadership, Act Blue, the Bush Foundation, and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. So here's what we have in store for you today. Our main stage, which I'm very excited to introduce in a bit, is Transforming Society Through Bridging. You will also have the option of 2 workshops after that. You will stay in this channel, Channel A, for the workshop presented by our sponsor Walmart called Building Belonging with Walmart.org, 3 Strategies to Bridge Divides. You can also choose to go to the citizen-led approach to revitalizing our democracy in Channel B. Instructions for all of that will be in the chat. And then last but not least, my favorite part is the Upswell Exchange, where we all come together at the very end and discuss everything we've learned and unpack our learnings together. And we're joined by our formidable partner in crime, Cheryl Hull Russell, who will be facilitating that session. She's the president and chief cultural consultant of Black Women Wise Women LLC. So again, keep your eyes on the chat box for all these clear instructions to get you here and there. Some housekeeping and logistics: all lines will be muted unless you're in a session where you can unmute yourself, like the exchange, and discuss. Any questions to the moderator or speakers can be left in the Q&A box. Any comments or shout outs or technical issues you can put in the chat. And a recording of today's pop-up will be available on upswell.org after the event. So with that, I will introduce our first session. So our main stage today is Transforming Society Through Bridging. I'll tell you a little bit about our 3 speakers and then hand it over to our moderator. So first up, we have Miss Loretta Ross. She's an award-winning and nationally recognized expert on racism and racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. Her work emphasizes the intersectionality of social justice issues and how intersectionality can fuel transformation. Ms. Ross is a visiting associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the program for the study of women and gender. She teaches courses on white supremacy, race and culture in America, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. She has written 3 books on reproductive justice, and her most recent book, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, is coming up this year. She's also well known for being the co-founder of Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Our second speaker is Reverend Myra Brown of the Spiritus Christi Church in Rochester, New York. where she sings in the gospel choir and leads the racial justice team. Reverend Brown and her colleagues formed Spiritus Christi as an independent Catholic church in 1999 after Rochester Diocese rejected them from allowing women to have prominent role at the altar during Mass and acknowledging marriage equality. She was ordained in 2017 and is only the third African-American woman to be ordained as a priest in the independent Catholic Church. The need for her racial justice work was underscored recently during a tense night between the Black Lives Matter protesters and Rochester police after the killing of Danielle Purd. Reverend Brown had the idea for the Elders program where prominent community leaders would serve as a barrier between police and protesters, herself included. And it is a pleasure to now introduce our moderator, Janine Lee, who I know from her service as a board member at Independent Sector. She also is the president and CEO of Philanthropy Southeast, the premier philanthropic network for courageous leaders, ideas, and resources focused on the American South and the US Caribbean territories. Philanthropy Southeast and its members spark transformative work that achieves lasting impact, advances equity, and builds a brighter future for the South, its communities, and its people. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you, Janine.
Thank you so much, Christina. So glad to be here this afternoon with all of you. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate with you, Reverend Brown, and also Professor Ross. Why don't we jump in? So I think I'd like to start by asking each of you to tell us just a little bit about your personal journey toward the work that you do today. Why don't we start with you, Reverend Brown? I think you are muted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I identify as she and her. My call, I think, to becoming an activist pastor was a combination of several life events. I'm the daughter of migrant workers from the racist segregated South who migrated to the North to work on a Northern camp, very similar to what they left, with the hope of better opportunities. And I think there were a couple of events that occurred for me that I think sort of directed me towards the work that I'm doing currently. That was part of my personal journey. I think at the age of 12, I was called the N-word for the first time for walking across a bridge in Cleveland, Ohio, going to a store on our way down to the South. That same year, when we returned, there was a man in our neighborhood who struggled with alcohol addiction. He would come back from police arrest with casts on different parts of his body. And when we asked how he got them, he would tell us that the police would beat him behind a wall at a nearby park every time they arrested him before taking him downtown. And of course, a few days later, the police were called on him, and we kids got the chance to follow the police car to that park, remembering what he told us. And sure enough, we witnessed the police taking him towards the wall. And as kids, we began sort of jumping up and down and saying, "We see you, you better not hit him, we're gonna tell." And we were able to get them to turn around. They stopped in the middle of the field, they huddled, and they got back in the car with him, with other cars that had joined them, and took him someplace else. Of course, when he returned to the neighborhood, he still had a cast on, telling us that they had taken him to a different place to beat him. The last event, I think, that was part of my journey as an activist pastor was when I took my first job as a lay minister in a mainstream Catholic church, hired to diversify ministries. And I encountered racism there in the church, where white coordinators refused to work with me or resisted any semblance of authority that I was given to change the organizational landscape to be more diverse. So all of these personal experiences, I think, have moved me towards the work that I'm doing today to create a more just, a more equitable and inclusive world as a pastor.
Such a powerful story, Reverend Brown. And if you don't mind, I just want to push a little bit more on that, because I think there was an ending to that story when you were a child. Can you tell a little bit more about what happened?
When I was 12?
Yes.
Yes. So when we started to say, "We see you, we're going to tell if you hit him." I think for us, we realized that at 12 years old, that there was a systemic problem with policing in our community. And I would learn much later, actually as an adult, why that was. That literally in Rochester, New York State, our policing blueprint was developed in 1819, and it was completely patterned after slave patrols. And so what he was getting was what the system of policing in this country was designed to give to people of color. At 12 years old, I didn't know that, but I had my first experience of how systemic the problem is in our systems that were really created to serve white people exclusively and to protect their wealth and property at any cost, really, and mostly on the bodies of Black and Brown folks.
Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
Professor Ross, same question. Could you tell us a little bit more about your journey and what brought you to your work today?
Well, thank you. And I want to say happy belated Juneteenth to people, because I just got off another panel talking about the importance of Juneteenth. So it's very much on my mind. I came from a military family. My father was in the service for 26 years, and I'm one of 8 kids. And we were moving from Fort Belvoir, Virginia to San Antonio, Texas. And we stopped at a gas station in Mississippi. And it was in the old days when the attendants used to pump the gas. So Dad went to use the bathroom while the attendant pumped the gas. And when he came out, the guy said, "You used the wrong bathroom. You used the wrong bathroom." And Dad looked up because he thought he meant the women's room. No, he meant he didn't go around the back and use the colored bathroom. And we got in our car, we drove off, and a few miles up the road, this car of white teenagers came up beside us and shot in the direction of our car. And I was 10 years old at the time. And Dad was so incensed that he pulled the car over, rooted around in the trunk of the car. I don't think these teenagers knew my dad was a weapons specialist in the Army. So he pulled out his rifle, and when this car of kids came back, he fired at them. But he deliberately missed them because he could have killed them. He was a marksman. And that was my introduction to things being different, because up to that time, I'd lived on Army bases that were relatively integrated compared to civilian life. And then the particulars of my journey is that at age 14, I was incested by a cousin, and I became pregnant as a result of that incest. And in 1968, abortion was not an option. So I had to have my son, which I did in 1969. And I chose to keep him instead of giving him up for adoption. And so that started my reproductive justice journey, because not having the right to decide whether or not I have sex or whether or not I'd continue a pregnancy. And the fact by keeping my son, I ended up co-parenting with my rapist. And so I tell the story about how none of those things should be happening to young Black girls. And so that's what propelled me into the movement specifically.
Thank you, Professor Ross. And thank you both for being willing to, we're right out of the chute sharing some really powerful and very painful experiences. And I think the audience today is going to learn that your families, your parents were powerful, powerful influencers of both of you. And that both of you speak truth to power, that both of you are all about justice and being just. And so I want to start with you, Reverend Brown, with a broader question. Your work has often been focused on elevating essentially unheard voices. And as a part of the Black Lives Matter protests in Rochester, you helped shelter protesters in your church. I know that you also put yourself between protesters and the police. And later, you held meetings with city leaders on how to handle these protests better. Can you tell us what drives your desire to connect these forces?
Yeah, I think life, I think my own lived experience drove my desire to connect these forces because, it's important to connect the altar with what happens on the streets. They're not separate and they're not independent of each other, even though they can look that way. I knew that I could not, as a pastor, say that I am connected or concerned for my parishioners if I'm not concerned about what hurts them and has its foot on their necks. And so that it meant for me, it was a step along the way to truly be a shepherd after God's own heart, which I'm committed to, right? That it is from God that we're given the courage, the wisdom, the opportunity to do good in the world. So, and to know that we're not alone in that. I believe that the author of harm needs to be the author of healing to address wrongs committed. And so it's been very important for me to do that. As an activist, I was an activist actually before I became a pastor. And so, I was concerned about the use of an 1819 policing blueprint patterned after slave patrols prior to what we found ourselves in 2020. We had marched on the streets. We had advocated. We'd had many conversations that led up to that moment. Our gospel is a social gospel calling us to stand with the poor, the oppressed, and those on the margins, just as Jesus did. Jesus spoke truth to power, expressed his anger at how power and system was being used to thwart the full participation of all, right? He turned over tables to send us that message in the temple. And so hypocrisy, all those things were important to Jesus. And as a pastor, it's important to me. And I think it's very essential that we connect those forces, the forces of harm, to make sure that they are hearing from the people who are being harmed. And then we have to make the biggest demand that we can, right? I think we tell people what we think of them by what we ask of them. And if we don't expect anything better or expect anything more, then we won't get it. And so for me, it was very, very important. I had those relationships in both places. I protests, was on the ground with the activists, but I was also, as a pastor, being called into, meetings with politicians and community leaders. And so I really had the perspective and the relationships on both sides. And it was very important for me to leverage those for justice.
Thank you for that. Wow, just some very powerful thoughts there. We tell people what we think of them by what we ask of them. That's something to hold on to. And also just thinking about what you said about the altar needs to align with what's happening on the streets. And then finally, the author or forces of harm need to be the author or forces of healing. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Very powerful. So Reverend Ross, Professor Ross, I apologize. You're a leading expert on challenging the cancel culture. And you teach a class called Calling In. And I'm just really fascinated to know more, especially considering that you have worked with, former Nazis and KKK. You're a courageous leader. And what is calling in? And how should we embrace this as a key part of our bridge building? And I acknowledge that you also are working on finalizing a book around calling in and calling out culture. So could you address that?
Yes, well, I started teaching my classes on calling in about 6 years ago, when I noticed how mean people were to each other over social media. I believe that people say anonymously things they don't dare say to somebody face to face. And so I started teaching this class at Smith College, and now I teach it online as well. People can check out my website if they want to know more about that. But calling in is basically a call out. But instead of doing a call out with anger and hate, you're doing a calling in with love and respect. And so you're calling attention to harm someone has done, but instead of putting them on public shaming for the harm, you are speaking to them through the lens of love and respect, so that you're seeking accountability without forgetting the humanity of the person that you're talking to. And that's very possible to do. I mean, none of us should suffer injustices silently. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that violence begets violence. Meanness begets meanness. And so if you want to change the cycle of violence, and if you want to change the cycle of hatred and harm, you're going to have to use a new tactic. And I believe that tactic is calling in, and I believe calling in will be to the 21st century human rights movement what nonviolence was to the 20th century civil rights movement. It is a description of how we do the work, how we behave and treat each other, and understanding that it starts off with learning to forgive yourself so that you can forgive others for the harm that they do. Self-forgiveness is so hard for people because we're taught to be racked with shame and guilt over a lot of stuff. And guilt is the most useless emotion, and so is shame. And so along with other people in the movement, the human rights movement, we're exhausted by the bitterness in our society, by the harm in our society, like gun violence, but also racism, hate crimes, injustices, the housing crisis. I could go on. But we have no way of solving any of these problems if we don't know how to talk to each other with love and respect. And so that's why I'm such a devotee of teaching people about calling in techniques.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. So forgiveness is one of the most powerful expressions of calling in. And what I'm hearing you say is that it is basically a call out, attention through the lens of love and respect. Thank you so much for that.
Can I just add where I learned about forgiveness in the best way?
Absolutely.
There's a young man named Chris Singleton, whose mother was killed in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in 2015. And when he was interviewed, he said, forgiveness is often seen as a sign of weakness, but it actually is a strength because it teaches you not to hold a grudge forever in your heart. And it's a way to reclaim your dignity from the person that's harmed you. And most people don't see forgiveness as a harm reduction strategy, as a reclamation of self. And I think that needs to be explained.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that. Reverend Brown, you said in an interview, I don't partner with systems of oppression. I call in systems of oppression. I call on systems of oppression to transform themselves, to dispense justice, and certainly to reimagine their role from harm to healing. How do we do this when systems of oppression are just all around us, especially now in times of such deep polarization that we're seeing all over the country and different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think the first thing is we have to not accept what is and take up a different vision for ourselves than what we have and what we know that we have the capacity to do and to get there together. I say that three of the most powerful words for me is no, I will not cooperate with this. Stop, there is harm happening here. And why? Why are we still here? Why are we still doing this? Why are we still functioning in that way? So I think it'll take re-education, modeling, mentoring, challenge, and the invitation to do something different. We have to create opportunities, I think, for people to feel in their bodies the experience of others. Sometimes we think that we're more different than we are alike. And that isn't necessarily true. We all have some experience of trauma. We all have some experience of pain. And sometimes it's calling people back to that collective experience to say, think about this. Trade places with this group of folks or this person, and tell me how that would land on your body, right? And so, of course, if that doesn't work, part of the strategy is that we have to create a crisis of integrity and a crisis of values for organizations that espouse one thing, but are clearly doing something else, reflecting a contradiction, right, that needs to be remedied. And so it really is kind of showing organizations and systems themselves and saying, hey, curious, is this really who you want to be? And if it isn't, would you like some help with that?
That's beautiful. I know that a number of the folks on the call have read the Intercept article titled Elephant in the Room, which actually speaks to much of what you just said regarding contradictions that need to be reconciled in some way. This crisis of integrity, it speaks to that as well. And you're right, we all have trauma and pain. And I think we can all just hold on to those three tenets that you talked about: know, stop, and why. Thank you for that. Professor Ross, in a recent speaking engagement, you stressed that victim narrative is not about letting harms and injustices get a free pass. It's about making choices about how you seek that accountability in a way that's more likely to be effective. How is it possible when it just really feels to folks that we are in a constant state of being attacked?
Well, obviously, we prioritize people's right and ability to take care of themselves. And so it's so important that you attend to your bleeding wounds, because if you don't, all you're going to do is bleed all over everybody you come in contact with, whether you're calling them in or out. And so the first priority, of course, is taking care of self and healing. And if you're in the process of doing that, you'll actually be awed by the results, because you'll develop the stamina and the resilience to not only do work against other people being victimized or violated the way you were. That's how I got into the anti-rape movement. As a rape survivor, my healing became part of the process of helping end rape for other women and survive it. But when you do that, what you develop is, first of all, the depths you didn't know you have, the strengths you didn't know you have, and the heart that could have been shut down forever by what harm happened to you can get reopened and welcome in people without shutting down the barriers so that you don't get hurt again. And I also teach people how to deal with discomfort and deal with harm, because sometimes we're harmed by the people we most love. It isn't always a stranger, and you can't shut your life off from the people who are capable of harming you. What you learn to do is to deal with that harm, help to mitigate it, and work towards preventing future harm. That's the way you deal with that process. And so I'm a critic of a victim narrative where people have bad stuff happen to them and they only define themselves by what happened to them. And I'm like, you are so much more than what happened to you. And so we need to help people learn to grow beyond what happened to them, because I mean, your lived experience is not a resume. You really can learn a whole lot more about your possibilities and who you are if you open up your heart again and accept that you have been harmed, you have been hurt, but there's more to you than those dirty fingerprints somebody else left on your life.
There's more to you than the dirty fingerprints somebody else left on your life. That is just powerful. And you are so much more than what happened to you. I remember Brian Stevenson also saying that we're all better than the worst thing we've ever done.
Mhm.
And I appreciate your thoughts about the strengths and depths that we didn't know we had. I mean, it's there. We just got to tap into it. We all have more strength and depth than we knew that we had. Reverend Brown, coming back to you, you indicated that all people, regardless of ethnicity, hold some sort of bias. Could you tell us more about that and how you have helped people wrestle with their biases when addressing anti-racism?
Sure. Yeah, we are, we live in a world that is framed in white supremacy, white domination. Our systems and institutions were legally and intentionally created to serve white people almost exclusively. And so there is a world messaging that we all receive about who's supposed to be on the top, who's supposed to be on the bottom. We're messaged about, what has more value, what holds least value. And so these messages come to us, what we're supposed to be afraid of, what we're supposed to be comfortable with, and who we're supposed to be comfortable with. We are inundated by messaging from our television shows, our news medias, from the music that we listen to. It's all around us, even the games that our kids play. Like, we're constantly being messaged, the education that children are receiving. So those messages get into us, and they do create implicit bias, right? In a lot of different ways. And so we all really need recovery from these biases, these stereotypes that are pushed into us without our permission. We didn't ask for it. And so we're navigating the world with things. And so what we try to do is help people wrestle with those biases when we're addressing anti-racism, right? First thing we try to help people do is commit to truth-telling, right? Truth-telling, just dethroning fear, dethroning ignorance, dethroning the wrongful use of power, right? I had a wonderful professor in seminary, Dr. Marvin McMickle, who used to say, you have to see something and then say something, right? And so we've created kind of an internal anti-racism team at Spiritus Christi. And we've instituted an annual opportunity to train all of our members in anti-racism. And that internal team is called SPARC. It stands for Spiritus Christi's Anti-Racism Coalition. It's a group of parishioners as well as community leaders that come together to stand against racism. And we have, over the years, joined each other in protest, advocacy, and education in the community on issues of racial injustice. And right now we're in the process of, taking that team to the next level, getting them ready to train them enough and deepen their analysis enough to be able to look at all of our policies and our practices through a racial justice lens as systemic work, because we want to embody the very thing that we are espousing. This year alone, we began requiring actually racial justice training for all of our staff and all of our leaders, and mapping out our commitment to decenter whiteness and create a fully inclusive, multicultural church. So we offer these trainings, and through those trainings, we have lecture, we have film, we use role playing, we take real stories from people's lives, and we have people play those out and to be able to recognize the elements of oppression that are embedded in that. And we try to help white folks and people of color really deepen their analysis of what they see around them, how to speak up, how to work for change, and to be aware that there will be real consequences, but to make that commitment to do it. And that it's the only way, right, that we're going to change our world. I have right now three actually, college students here living with me from the University of Colorado. I take students from colleges during the summer who come on a work study program. And these girls, there were 4 of them initially, one of them just quit. But they came to my house to stay with me so they could do their work study. And when they went to the towns surrounding our city, they encountered racism and bias from the folks who were in these town halls saying things, like, we've heard stories about, your group and stories about your company, and we don't want you here, and you could be sexual predators for all we know. Now, 3 of these girls were girls of color. One was a white girl, and they had very different experiences when they went out. And so, for us, we stepped right into that. We put up a post because I think it is important to let the community know that we aren't exactly what we say we are, that there's a problem. We put up the post, and I've been in communication with the town supervisors of all of these towns, setting up meetings so that we can unpack this and give these girls justice, right? And so leveraging those relationships and reaching out to who I did know, the people that I didn't know, having phone calls, carving out that time to say, look, this is what happened. This is why it is unnecessary and unacceptable. And here's what we need to do to start to move forward, because it's not okay. It's not okay. And so I think it's really important to take those stands, to try to educate people, to have them not take a situation and think that it's an individual solution. These are systemic problems, and they will require systemic solutions. And that is the work that we're focused on, to help people understand that it's bigger than just that one incident. The system, the institution held on to that experience and either protected it, dismissed it, minimized it, or ignored it. And that's a systemic problem. That isn't just something between 2 employees or 3 employees.
Thank you for that, Reverend Brown. I note a few things that you said here. One was that if you see something, you got to say something. And it's important to commit to truth telling, dethroning fear, dethroning abuse of power. We've got to deepen the analysis for what they see around them. All of us need to do that. And also the systemic problems require systemic solutions. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to go to both of you on this. I'm going to come back to you, Professor Ross. The Intercept recently published the story that I referenced earlier titled Elephant in the Zoom, about how internal tension between staff and leadership have a way of either accelerating organizational change or distracting the organization from its own renewal. So here's the question. What's important for leaders to remember about bridging all the divides that happen inside of their organizations and movements? And a subsequent question to that is, how do they not tear each other apart in the process? Much of what we saw happening in the article itself. So I'm going to start with you, Professor Ross, and then we'll go to Reverend Brown.
Yes, well, what we find now is that through the advent of social media, anybody with a keyboard can be a critic. It used to be for many organizations that their worst critics were outside of the organization as competitors or opponents. But now we're finding that some of the worst critics are on our own payrolls, are within the organization because of the call-out culture. Now, many people take to social media to complain about things that they don't necessarily feel safe in talking about face-to-face, particularly when there's power differentials involved. But the problem with the call-out culture is that it doesn't work. That if you put either an individual or an organization on blast, chances are it may not work. Now, I understand why people choose that tactic, because that's what the human rights movement has always done. We call out people and institutions that violate people's human rights, like Reverend Brown talked about. But we don't do it as a first resort. We try other methods first. We try talking to the people. We try to set up meetings with them. We try letter writing campaigns. We do a whole lot of other things before we do the call out and the public shaming as a human rights movement. But too often people are using the calling out as their first tactic, not their last. And so it's creating a lot of dysfunction, particularly within our social justice organizations, because we're dealing with some very ugly stuff within our organizations, first of all. And it's people who've been through a lot, who've been through trauma, that are drawn to our organizations to work for us. And so we should stop being surprised that our entire workforce is comprised of traumatized people who then bring that to the office, who bring that to their workforces. And so we need to anticipate that and learn how to professionally handle that instead of being dismayed by it or surprised by it, because that anger is really the fuel for their passion. And so we have to teach them how to do better threat assessments, how not to turn on each other, how not to be afraid of power and dehumanize people just because they have positions of authority and things like that. But the ultimate lesson, I think, is within social justice organizations, we need to teach the concept of servant leadership, because entirely too often, people think the organization is supposed to serve them instead of their need and requirement to serve the organization. And so I could go on about that, but I've seen a lot of our organizations and movements implode. And I'm not just talking about the nonprofit sector, because the for-profit sector is in equal disarray because of the call-out culture.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Professor Ross. If I could just build on that question a little bit, because in the article, Elephant in the Zoom, it was kind of based on the scenario, essentially, that a company had basically called their staff together after the murder of George Floyd. And the company wanted to do something to support the external community, but the staff was calling for them to first kind of get their own house in order in terms of how they interacted and treated people of color in particular within the organization. And this set off a series of concerns, debate, anger, etc. And so I'm just interested and curious, you did mention that, you know, often people in the workforce come in with, they're traumatized. But in this scenario, they were also traumatized by the organization itself. Any thoughts you have on that?
It's an and strategy that, yes, organizations need to clean up their house so that they recognize that their workforce is younger, queerer, more female, more people of color. They do need to do that, but it's not an either or. You need to do both the internal work and the external work at the same time. But what happens too often is that these internal implosions paralyze the organization so that they not only can't do the internal work, but it even compromises their effectiveness in doing their mission-driven work, what were they organized to do kind of thing. And so that's why we're often called in to help people deal with both of those realities, because obviously you don't want to put up a big Black Lives Matter sign on your website and then have Black employees who don't feel like they're being treated fairly within the organization. And so you do want to work on both of those problems simultaneously, as opposed to say, well, we can't do the external until we fix the internal, or we only do the external and ignore what's going on the internal.
Thank you for that. So Reverend Brown, your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for that. I think for me, I agree with what she just said, and I think that's really powerful. What I would add is, I think as a leader, it's important to commit to knowing what is happening in your organization. It shouldn't be an afterthought, right? We should not be relying on middleman or middlewoman information and having information filter through an organization through a power lens, which is often where the problem lies. The lens of powerlessness is the lens by which we should get our information, right? And credible messengers in the organization is really important. So I think as a leader, you have to position yourself to have real-time information, to step out of these hierarchical norms of going up the ladder and creating these bureaucracies to get information, and to center the voices of the people of color, and then believe them, believe what they tell you, right? For us in our organization, we had a situation where, we had a divide that was happening with people of color and white people in one of our leadership teams. And one of the things that we did, because I, as the leader at that time, I knew that we were still working on systemic racism within our organization. And so I stopped the conversation as it began to get more toxic. And what I did is I asked the white people on that team to stop and go caucus with a white leader that had been trained by us in racial justice work. And so they needed to go and reflect and caucus about what happened there, where those thoughts of white supremacy and racism and white domination and control and fear was coming from in their safe space with somebody who could actually guide them to unpack it, to see the harm that was happening there. And at the same time, I asked the people of color to caucus with me so that I could provide some care for them and talk about the healing that needed to happen there, right? And so it's really important for leaders to lead from the top, right? And to educate yourself as a leader so that you can kind of navigate the organization through it and you're not floundering. Often what happens is people have a good idea, but they have not invested in their own training, their own knowledge around it. They haven't invested and expanded in their own racial stamina and their racial knowledge around this. You can't lead it if you don't have it, right? And so that's part of why these collisions keep happening, because people want to do something and they think that anything is better than nothing, but that's not the case when we're talking about racial divides and trying to bridge these gaps. Like, we actually have to know something. I often tell my white people that I work with, I said, listen, don't talk to me about this is coming out of nowhere. I don't want to hear anything that's coming out of nowhere. Go and learn about what it is that you want to talk to me about, and then come and schedule a time to talk to me about it, right? Because it's a waste of their time and it's a waste of my time. If we're going to do really significant work, then we have to give ourselves to the work, give ourselves to the information, give ourselves to the analysis. Then we can carve a path forward. But I no longer actually have ignorant conversations with people anymore. I don't do it because it's not helpful to them, and it's not helpful to me, and it's not helpful to moving the arc towards justice. If we're really interested in making changes, then we have to invest in the changes we want to see.
Well, and it really comes back, Reverend Brown, to what you were saying is we've got to deepen the analysis of what we see around us. And certainly, even being a Black woman in philanthropy for the past 32 years, I can be in the same room with a group of white folks and there's microaggressions coming toward me and people don't even see it. And so I think it's really important to deepen that analysis and pay attention to what you're seeing around you. So I do want to just acknowledge that there were a couple of questions in the chat. I hope that during this last exchange that we had about elephant in the Zoom that we answered Christine Polson's question. She had asked, could we share information on the article, Elephant in the Room? I believe it is Elephant in the Zoom from the Intercept. And the link was provided really for everyone who maybe has not had a chance to read the article. And then I wanted just to make sure there's a question that came in. Can you share your thoughts around leveraging storytelling to reframe narratives and or intentionally curating content that will begin shifting perspectives. So I'm going to read that question again. Can you share your thoughts around leveraging story or storytelling to reframe narratives and or intentionally curating content that will begin shifting perspectives? First, I just want to make sure, Lorian, that that question was intended for our speakers here. If you could just put a note in there, we'll come back to your question. Okay. All right, I think I just want to make sure I've covered those questions. Okay, I'm going to come to my last question for both of you, and we can come back to Lorian once I get a note from him.
I think she wrote yes to that.
All right, so this is for both of you. Considering the daunting reality of numerous divides and oppressive systems in our lives, especially for Black and Native people and people of color, where should each of us start to bridge? How do we do that? Where do we start to bridge? And I'll start with you, Professor Ross.
Well, in the civil rights movement, we used to say, when the world is a mess, don't despair, just start cleaning where you are. And this is so important. Many of us can change our toxic relationships with people in our communities, in our families, in our neighborhoods. We really have the opportunity to envision and build the world that we need and deserve. But it does require a lot of little baby steps, like not giving up on having a good conversation with your mother-in-law or your next door neighbor or that. But I think that it requires a pretty good threat assessment. That's the other thing I wanted to say in response to the storytelling question too, that you have to be able to distinguish between people who are actively pursuing harm to each other and people who are accidentally causing harm to each other. There is a difference between intent that is malicious and intent that is accidental, which is why I smile when Reverend Brown was speaking, because I spend a lot of time talking to white people who are inadvertently racist. And they don't mean to be, because they have a good opinion of themselves inside, but they're not matching it with their public behaviors. And so I spend a whole lot of time, I actually call myself the white girl whisperer on my campus, dealing with addressing an alignment between how they think good they think they are inside and what their public behaviors are. That can be aligned, I believe, but you align by building on that interior goodness instead of focusing on the external badness.
Such a great point, Professor Ross, and such a great point as we prepare to transition from this call. Thank you for that. And Reverend Brown, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Ross. I was thinking a similar thing that I think we start to bridge where we have influence or where we can have impact or where we'd like to have influence or impact. I think having a good assessment of the circles of influence that we're connected to is really important. Like, who do I know that knows somebody, that knows somebody, that knows somebody? You know, and really leverage. I see myself as really leveraging my life, my whole life. Often when things happen in our community, I'm kind of going through the community Rolodex, like, who do I know that I can pick up the phone and call? Who do I know that I can shoot a text to? Hey, did you know about this? Hey, can we have a conversation about this? And really, you know, stepping in fully for the love of my community, right? I'm a pastor, right? And so the scripture says God so loved the world. And if God had that much love for the world, that means that there's tremendous amount of goodness in the world that we're not always aware of. And we have to hold on to that core goodness and fight for it, right? To fight for it, knowing that there are things, messaging and bad intel that horrible socializations that take people away from the vision for our human family. And I think it's really important for us to fight for who we want to be, and to continue to do that fighting for who we want to be, and to not step back, to not give in to fear and ignorance and intimidation, and denial and resistance, all those things that will come, to get us off course to finishing the work and doing the work. And I think we have to just stand flat-footed and say, I will not be moved. It's like a tree planted by a river of water. I will not be moved until we deal with this, right? Until we take this to a very different place than the harm that it's causing right now. And I would say sometimes it's scary. I don't always know what I'm going to say. When I get there, I just know sometimes that I need to get there. And I have to trust that God will give me what to say in that moment. I have to trust that I will be moved in a way to help people see it a different perspective than what they were seeing in this original harm that was caused. And I think storytelling is one of the most powerful tools that we have been given. We all carry a story. We carry our histories in our bodies. We carry our stories. And those stories have impacted us one way or the other. And sometimes it's helping people pull out their story and juxtaposition that story against this new story that is happening. And so I think story is very powerful. I use it a lot in our training. That's why I use a lot of, video kind of unpacking a story. And then, I have people role play many stories and then pick out, those elements that are in there. What did you see tokenism in there? What does that look like? Did you experience a microaggression? Where did you see that kind of happening in this story? All right. Did you see a blaming of the victim happening in that story? Did you see institutional norm being set and the use of power? Did you see, right, internalized superiority and internalized inferiority that was coming up? Where did you see that? Where do you think that came from? Let's talk about it. So I think story is very powerful. We are beings of story. We all have a story that brought us here to this moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And thank you both for addressing Lorianne's question about storytelling. It does look, Professor Ross, as if Belinda, I believe it's De Jesus, asked the question, are the past lecture courses for calling in available by video if the full course is purchased? I'd like to catch up and plan to attend the third course tonight.
Yes, if you've registered for the course and registration is $20 for the full course, then you get access to all the videos from the 4 sessions. And it's at my website, lorettaross.com.
Very good, very good. I was just checking again to see if there's any other questions from the audience that came up, and I don't see any. If you asked a question that we have not, oh, there is a question from Deb Macon. Professor Ross, when is the next course?
Tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern.
Very good, tonight. Okay, wonderful. So I think we will be transitioning to the workshops, not off the call, to the workshops at 2:10. And so our time, Reverend Brown and Professor Ross, is almost up. So I wanted to just ask both of you, we've got incredible, extraordinary nonprofit leaders, philanthropic leaders on this call from all over the country. And what would be your closing thoughts? Anything you want to share with them that would be important for them to carry from this call? I'll give you just a moment to think about that. But if you had something that you really wanted them to walk away with, what would that be? And I'll start with you, Reverend Brown.
I think that I attended a talk once with Travis Smiley, and he said, pay attention to what disturbs you and give yourself to that. So that's what I would say, you know, that sometimes we think it's just an emotion or a feeling, but it's not. Sometimes it's what we're being called to being called to what disturbs us. You know, we paid attention to that in our city, and through the Black Community Focus Fund, we worked with our community, and we're now in the process of building an outdoor civil rights heritage park, telling the story of the Black freedom struggle in our city, unmasking our own story, excavating our own story, so that we can put on display and introduce in a larger way the heroes and sheroes of the movement here locally. And that has been transformative in our community, that work. But I think it began with, you know, a race convoy south, where we paid attention to what disturbed us. And we've continued to give ourselves to that work. Sometimes we are told that, you know, I have to pick my battles. I'm actually don't believe that. I think that if they bring the battle to your doorstep, the battle has already been picked, right? So give yourself to what disturbs you and what is harming your community and the people that you love.
And Reverend Brown, that was really a beautiful, beautiful way to close out. But I just want to give you just a moment if you'd like to share just a little bit more about the Civil Rights Heritage Park. It sounds really extraordinary. If there's anything you want people to know about it, when will it open, and a little bit more about its meaning and its special purpose to the community.
Yeah, we hope to do a ribbon cutting this summer. Hopefully by the end of the summer. We are raising funds for it right now. We've raised $1 million or more, and we're hoping to raise another $1 million. It's going to be an amazing project and a park. I think it's going to live for generations to come, to really inspire people to the work that just ordinary folks can do. You know, you don't have to be famous. It can be people like Mildred Johnson, you know, who, you know, she worked with people and advocated for folks in the courthouse. She made sure that people had jobs, you know, she picked up the phone, she challenged folks, you know, and so it's really a work of love for our community, and to calling each of us, the ordinary and the extraordinary person, to do something great for God in the world. And so we're very excited about that. They can learn more if they go to the Black Community Focus Fund website, rbcff.org. And they can learn about the Civil Rights Park. They can buy a brick for a freedom fighter, a truth teller, or a voice for justice, a person who was a voice for justice in that park, as part of the Legacy Walk. It's going to be an amazing place to do civic engagement, and really just kind of teach the generations that come after us, as well as the ones that exist now, on what it looks like to be a freedom partner, as we tell the story of the Black freedom struggle.
Thank you. And again, it's rbcff.org.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Professor Ross, your closing thoughts.
It took me a while to realize that my business is the production and the living out of hope. You know, because you have to believe that things can change and will change in order to be a human rights and social justice activist. And when you're mired in looking at the ugly things people can do to each other, it is so easy to lose hope in belief in a better future. And so I'm constantly telling people that our business is hope, and we have to make this work irresistible to people. Show them how you can not only have fun, but that activism is the art of making your life matter. That you really can enjoy being of service to your community, and you'll get awed by the results, because everything you ever dreamed for is going to fall in your lap when you serve your people.
Goodness gracious. Well, Professor Ross and Reverend Brown, you both are extraordinary, extraordinary women with great humility. You give all of us hope and an aspiration for a better future. You've been an inspiration today, and it has been a great privilege and honor for me to serve as your moderator today. Thank you for everything you do. And I just want to say how much we appreciate you.
Thank you for having us.
So much. Yes, it's an honor to be with you. Blessings.
Thank you, all three of you, for an incredible conversation. Not shy to say I teared up many, many times you all were speaking. I think that is always a sign of a really good session. I'm very excited to continue talking about it at the exchange with everyone. So now we're going to move to our 2 workshops, and hopefully this amazing conversation sets a stage for you all to go deep